As James Joyce admitted to Jacques-Benoît Mequin, he weaves puzzles throughout his narrative fiction. This presentation chases down clues to one puzzle whose solution turns understanding his fiction into a primer on creation and how an artist's spiritual creation can imitate God's material creation. As suggested by Stephen's vision of himself in Buck's cracked mirror, we seek references to art as life's mirror, references stretching from Aristotle's mimesis to Zola's vivisective art, as well as to art as a mystery, as a veil rather than a mirror, to quote Oscar Wilde's Vivian. We will also note a progress in Joyce's fiction from Stephen's subtle errors in Portrait through explicit errors and unsolvable riddles in Ulysses to Wake as the epitome of ambiguity. A progress in which these apparent faults act as clues to understanding why Joyce's aesthetic mirror is intentionally cracked. Associated with these clues, we will catch glimpses of Oscar Wilde and the aesthetic movement, blended with sin as both a metaphor for the cracks, as well as sin placed at the surface of a theory of beauty. My thesis is that both Joyce and Wilde exploit a type of hylomorphism to bring about an aesthetic effect based upon not what is explicit in form, in the case of literature, as fixed in text, but upon what is left out, even if that absence is only accuracy or clarity. Absences that exert a unique pressure on the reader, a pressure that turns readers into professors. As we will see, the key to solving this puzzle metaphorically equates these faults in the narrative with Eve's original sin, a fault that St. Augustine described as a happy one. But we begin with Hamlet's mirror. Prince Hamlet advises his players within a play to not overstep the modesty of nature, for anything so overdone is from the purpose of playing, whose end is to hold as toward the mirror up to nature, to show the very age and body of the time his form and pressure. The age and body of those times, says Mary Thomas Crane, saw a transition between days when people attributed unexplained phenomena to supernatural forces, and days ahead when such attributions would no longer satisfy. Crane says the play joins form and pressure in a technical philosophical sense that suggests a means of accessing direct knowledge about the world and how it works. Earlier, the prince refers to his memory, upon whose wax-like form knowledge with the proper pressure may imprint a lasting image, recalling Aristotle's metaphor of a wax impression to explain how the human senses can take in the form of something perceived without the matter that constitutes it, just as the wax receives the impression of the signet ring without the iron or gold. But since the 1572 observation of Vita Cassiopeia called Tycho's supernova, traditionally accepted principles have been thrown into doubt. Invisible forces, such as Aristotle's celestial spheres, could no longer be called upon to explain events and attitudes. Crane describes the shift as from supernatural to preternatural explanations, where preternatural causes may not yet be known, but work through intelligible means. And the prince's means for evoking the king's confession is a play that does not overstep nature, meaning the play should mirror life faithfully and attribute a character's motions to intelligible causes. Indeed, the play within a play will mirror Claudius's actions in the Murder of Gonzago speech, suggesting that the author, or at least his protagonist, also favored preternatural causes. Crane cites Howard Machitello, who has argued that the mousetrap functions as the very hallmark of science, the experiment testing Claudius by trying to cause the artificial experience of an authentic reaction. 3 centuries later, the supernatural-preternatural distinction still aroused debate. Opposing his day's romanticism, Émile Zola sought a scientific aesthetics in a renewed naturalism. His 1880 Le Roman Expérimental latched onto the brutal example of French physiologist Claude Bernard as a metaphor for his vivisective art meant to expose a corrupt society's beating heart to stimulate its reform. Opposing Zola, Oscar Wilde, proponent of the aesthetic movement, in his essay The Decay of Lying, has his protagonist Vivian argue that Hamlet's intentions serve only to unambiguously demonstrate his insanity. Far from being a faithful representation of life, art is a veil rather than a mirror, says Vivian. Cyril responds, I can quite understand your objection to art being treated as a mirror. You think it would reduce genius to the position of a cracked looking-glass. But you don't mean to say that you seriously believe that life imitates art, that life in fact is the mirror, and art the reality. And Vivian answers, certainly I do. Life imitates art far more than art imitates life. Later, when Cyril says, surely you would acknowledge that art expresses the temper of its age, the spirit of its time, Vivian responds, certainly not. Art never expresses anything but itself. This is the principle of my new aesthetics, and it is this more than that vital connection between form and substance on which Mr. Pater dwells that makes music the type of all the arts. Walter Pater, that is, a key figure in the aesthetic movement, hence Wilde's Vivian would replace the peripatetic hylomorphism, that vital connection between form and substance, with the maxim art for art's sake. Joyce's protagonist appears to sympathize with Zola. Stephen Beadless of The Draft, who would build an entire science of aesthetic, says to Cranley, "The modern spirit is vivisective. Vivisection itself is the most modern process one can conceive." In Portrait, Stephen Dedalus says a classmate would describe his aesthetic theory as applied Aquinas, and explains how St. Thomas anticipates his theory of universal beauty as the most satisfying relations of the sensible, which correspond to the necessary phases of artistic apprehension. Aquinas says, "Ad pulcritudinem tria requiruntur integritas consonantia claritas." I translate it so: three things are needed for beauty: wholeness, harmony, and radiance. The modernism and realism reflect the naturalist movement, and the modified hylomorphism, now in three distinct stages, seems scientific. But then Stephen tends to get things wrong. For instance, regarding his theory of beauty, Father Butt admits that it was a new sensation for him to hear Thomas Aquinas quoted as an authority on aesthetic philosophy. One looks in vain for any Thomistic aesthetic theory, and as Father Copleston says, what he does have to say on the matter is mostly borrowed from other writers, so that though his remarks may be taken as the starting point of an aesthetic theory, it would be a mistake to develop an aesthetic theory on the basis of his remarks and then attribute that theory to him. And Stephen's description of claritas calls on some odd examples. First, he notes the supreme quality felt by the artist when the aesthetic image is first conceived in his imagination. The mind in that mysterious instant Shelley likened beautifully to a fading coal. But Stephen gives only half of the quote. Quoting Shelley further, "The greatest poet even cannot say it, for the mind in creation is as a fading coal, which some invisible influence like an inconstant wind awakens to transitory brightness. This power arises from within, and the conscious portions of our natures are unprophetic either of its approach or its departure. So the coal doesn't fade upon inspiration, it brightens, and it does so furtively, not as the end product of two other phases." As Father Noon says, the scholastics have almost always spoken, as Aquinas does, of integrity, proportion, and clarity as objective qualities or existential properties in things. They have not treated these qualities as though they belong to the act of apprehension. They are conceived of as being known in one single simple act, which cannot be divided in phases. Father Noon holds that it would seem more consistent to apply his distinction in reverse. Then we should say that integritas is that in virtue of which one comes to know the object as one thing, and consonantia is the principle of order. Hence, Stephen reverses St. Thomas's contingencies, interpreting the existential Thomism analytically. The universal beauty he reaches for, as opposed to being a lived or intuited experience, is grasped intellectually in phases. Finally, Noon points to the conclusion that Aquinas at any rate states the matter in exactly the reverse order, and does so in the paragraph which immediately precedes the one Stephen quotes. Stephen's second example expands upon the phases production, saying, "The instant wherein that supreme quality of beauty is apprehended luminously by the mind is a spiritual state very like that cardiac condition Luigi Galvani, using a phrase almost as beautiful as Shelley's, called the enchantment of the heart." At best a loose translation from De Viribus Electricitatis in Motu Musculare Commentarius, where in Introduction 17 Galvani calls attention to the incantesimo spell of the heart, a momentary cessation of heart pulsations which he noted in frogs when a needle was inserted into their spinal canals. As a voice for a scientific aesthetic, Stephen is at best problematic. But do the character's errors indicate anything about the artist's intentions? Does Joyce intentionally undercut Stephen's aesthetics? If Stephen's errors leave us wondering whether they were intentional or not, certain errors and ambiguities we find in Ulysses leave no doubt that they were intentional. A meticulous planner, Joyce wrote Ulysses with references at hand. Frank Budgeon says Joyce wrote Wandering Rocks with a map of Dublin before him, on which were traced in red ink the paths of the Earl of Dudley and Father Conmee. Clive Hart says he calculated to a minute the time necessary for his characters to cover a given distance of the city. Don Gifford offers evidence that Joyce gleaned facts from copies of the Evening Telegraph and Freeman's Journal from the day of the book's events, all to support verisimilitude. And while the novel is full of those innocuous facts of daily life that Wilde's Vivian argues trivialize fiction, there are instances in the book when the facts in fiction, as well as some of the seemingly analogous facts outside the novel, do not cohere, according to Luca Crispi, who focuses on the Blooms' several first nights as one example. Was it July 86 with Luke Doyle in Dolphin's Barn, or May 87 with Matt Dillon on Kimmage Road? Even a close reading discloses two distinct first nights. Argues Crispi, the textual history of these scenes indicates that it was James Joyce himself who was imprecise about these facts in the novel. Crispi charts Joyce's still evolving plot, which may account for some ambiguity, but considering that Joyce wrote with a map before him, how can one account for what Hart describes as the last and most obvious of all of episode 10's inconsistencies? As the cavalcade completes its journey, the narrator states, "At the Royal Canal Bridge from his hoarding Mr. Eugene Stratton bade all comers welcome to Pembroke Township." Lockhart notes, the narrator has his canals mixed. The Royal Canal is the one to the north of the city. This is the Grand Canal. Today, a century removed from that day, much of the finer details seems too antique to be second-guessed, and to the casual reader, such minutiae seem irrelevant. However, in his day, Joyce could easily research the facts, yet errors persist. Even superficial research exposes these errors, but if the errors in ambiguity are purposeful, what is their purpose? If Stephen is right, and that's still in question, these errors must offer not a mirror whose surface reflects what it faces, but portals of discovery through which a reality that differs from surface appears. The errors may go unnoticed by the casual reader, but they catch the attention of the close reader, tempting one to do a little further research before trusting the sincerity of Joyce's text. But errors aren't Joyce's only clue. If we follow references to creation, sin, and mirrors, we will discover associations that bridge the three novels. Beginning our Odyssey and Portrait, consider another of Stephen's aesthetic pronouncements. The mystery of aesthetic like that of material creation is accomplished. The artist, like the god of creation, remains within or behind or beyond or above his handiwork, invisible, refined out of existence, indifferent, paring his fingernails. If Stephen wants to create like God, one would expect him to strive for perfection. But if we compare Stephen's analog, the mystery of material creation, close readers detect another family of clues in Ulysses centered around the numbers 11 and 32, found in proximity to paradisiacal symbolism. For instance, Bloom thinks Elijah 32 feet per sec as he gauges the descent rate of his crumpled-tossed flyer chased by gulls. In his mind, Bloom links a Jewish prophet, subject to the flyer announcing the coming of Zion, with a natural law of science. Simultaneously, scientist Bloom performs an experiment to gauge whether or not the gulls will fall for his false lure. Not a bit, observes Bloom, concluding that nature's creatures cannot be fooled by something that only appears pleasing. He next thinks of Hamlet's ghost. In Circe, moments before 32 workmen break ground on the new Bloomusalem, Bloom adds another link in the chain, nominating his Grand Vizier, his faithful charger Couple Felix, a chain linking Ulysses to similar phrases in Finnegan's Wake, such as, "O Phoenix culprit." Ethnologist Joseph Campbell traces the clues throughout Wake, as a date, a paragraph in legal code, a musical composition, etc. Campbell links the numbers to St. Paul's Roman epistle, chapter 11, verse 32, "For God has consigned all to disobedience, that God may have mercy upon all," referring to Eve's sin in the garden. St. Augustine defended the doctrine of original sin, explaining that God did not create evil, nor was God capable of an imperfect act of creation. Our inherited sin is not evidence of a flawed creator, nor of our inherent wickedness. Rather, it is evidence of our free will. Unlike the other material creations, even angels, which must of necessity be drawn to God's perfect beauty, people are free to choose to turn to God or not. Naturally, with choice we also have doubt. St. Thomas recognized the benefit in that double nature. As contingent beings, humans stand in an ambiguous identity with our Creator. We are like God in free will, but unlike God in perfection. With no access to certainty, perfect knowledge, a Christian must accept God on faith. Still, by accepting God on faith, we earn our redemption as a step toward re-entering paradise. Therefore, says St. Augustine, our fault is a happy one, a line picked up in the Praeconium Paschal, or Easter Exultet, O Felix culpa, O happy fault that earned for us so great, so glorious a Redeemer. The hymn, in praise of the Paschal Candle, includes the praise of the bee, recalling the Virgilian renewal image. Tracing bee sting references leads us to that bridge, joining the aesthetic movement and sin as a theme. For instance, in episode 14, Bloom's wound mysteriously results from tussling with a horrible and dreadful dragon. J.S. Atherton discovers the sting's farcical description associated with Bernard Mandeville, known for his work The Fable of the Bees, advocating vice as a social benefit, but here cited as the subject of W. Peacock's English prose Mandeville to Ruskin, the latter, in a Joycean nod to Oscar Wilde, being John Ruskin, Wilde's tutor and another leader of the aesthetic movement. Near day's end, both Bloom and Molly reflect on the sting. Bloom, with lighted candle, considers the nova in 1901 and the drift of the so-called fixed stars, the possibility of redemption, a mention of Hamlet's author in the same sentence with Cassiopeia, a conclusion having weighed the matter and allowing for possible error of the existence of a heaven tree that was in Utopia, and culminating with a memory of a sting inflicted 2 weeks and 3 days previously by a bee, a calculation that Gifford notes is off by a day. For her part, Molly reverses the paradisiacal symbolism, recalling that the bee stung Bloom on Whit Monday, a cursed day, as hot as blazes, the reference sandwiched between Molly's thoughts of Blazes Boylan and the sweets of sin. Like the purposeful errors, these puzzling associations mark points of fascination, tempting close readers as Eve was tempted, and forcing professors to research beyond the text. The apparent flaws and seemingly unsolvable riddles create a sundering of reader and writer, or rather the written, condemning Joyce's mirror to be less faithfully accurate. However, in emulation of Wilde's theory of beauty, these sins in the text become the vehicle for a pending reconciliation. Just as one is free to take Stephen seriously or ironically, one is free to ponder Wilde's sincerity as the voice of Vivian and his protagonist's dismissal of Aristotle. The essayist Joyce discovers a consistent peripatetic strain in Wilde. In his essay on Wilde's Salome, Joyce reviews the poet's own defense of The Picture of Dorian Gray. Wilde notes that Gray's sins are never explicit, hence what sins one finds in the character are sins the reader brought. Joyce says, "Here we touch the pulse of Wilde's art, sin placed at the service of a theory of beauty. At its very base is the truth inherent in the soul of Catholicism, that man cannot reach the divine heart except through that sense of separation and loss called sin, or, in Stephen's syllogistic mirroring from the library, where there is a reconciliation, there must have been first a sundering." Stephen refers to Anne's sins, which supposedly inspired her cuckolded playwright husband to craft wicked female characters. Wilde's characters' sins are those imputed by the reader, imputed of necessity to make aesthetic sense of the sin's effects rendered explicitly in text and the portrait. The gap, or separation, between facts expressed in text and those ascribed by readers define for each reader his or her own Dorian. Only the lack or loss of Gray's explicitly rendered sins allows for the reconciliation that makes the narrative whole. Because Wilde left the facts open, each must insert one's own, hence the reader is free to imagine Gray's sins. The incomplete text is that sundering whose fixed form inspires the pressure that tempts the reader's imagination. In his 1903 Paris Notes, Joyce discusses S.H. Butcher's view of this aesthetic hylomorphism. As opposed to a reproduction of natural objects, Butcher says, art expresses nature, which in Aristotle is not the outward world of created things, it is the creative force, or Hamlet's pressure. Fixed laws govern material change, reasoned Aristotle. That rationalism withstood even the heavens shuddering by Tycho's Nova. Many retained faith that whether or not the law was known, change had natural, if only preternatural causes. But even Aristotle saw that material and aesthetic changes differed. Though essentially similar, form in art expresses a unique pressure. The artifact, be it paint, stone, or text, like the signet ring, doesn't change. Only the wax changes, a change contingent upon the pressure. The pressure of Wilde's mirror inspires readers to cast what sins they will into the form of Gray's portrait. That freedom in the pressure transcends Zola's radical naturalism. Made of glass but not cracked, Zola's mirror reflects only what confronts it, reducing the artist's role to reproduction, as Cyril says, limiting the art produced to a report. Viewing the subject and report side by side, one can judge art's value as a measure of accuracy. The freedom in Wilde's mirror comes from the cracks, freeing each reader to imagine what sins each might, rendering Wilde's character uniquely sinful for each, albeit limiting the freedom to that single metric of sin. Where Wilde offers a freely variable mirror of sin in text, Joyce seeks a reconciliation beyond the text. Not limited to any given metric, Joyce's mirror incorporates cracks that span the novels, crafting an imitation Dublin in narrative laced with subtle flaws and ambiguities. Joyce challenges each reader to recreate what Joyce has created, only to find the vision produced is unique to each reader, Finnegan's Wake as epitome. The casual reader may enjoy the novels unimpeded by puzzling intrusions, while the close reader is free to ponder endlessly the unsolvable conundrums, like the Blooms' first night, and wonder about the writer's intentions. To fathom those intentions, we have the text, paraphrasing A.E., a challenge evoking Stephen's second instance of Agenbite of Inwit, a Kentish rendering of Remorse of Conscience from a 14th century treatise on the seven deadly sins, also known as Mirror of the World. This recalls the morning's first instance, reflecting on the possibility of payment from Haynes for a collection of sayings, such as cracked looking-glass of a servant. Readers may connect it with Stephen's description as Dana's only contributor who asks for pieces of silver, or a later conversation when Artefoni tells him he could earn income from his musical art. Stephen says instead he is resigned to his sacrificio incruenta, his bloodless sacrifice, a sacrament of communion in the Christian context seeking a reparation of sins, but in ancient Greece, a vegetal offering propitiating fructivity. The Bible suggests the relationship between sin and fructivity. Returning to the paradisiacal context, one recalls that only after the veil of innocence had lifted did the first parents go forth and multiply. The possibility of progeny only followed expulsion from paradise. What fructivity Stephen might desire we can guess from one of Joyce's most obvious clues. The Sundering in Ulysses lies between the facts in text and the facts that existed at one pointed moment, June 16, 1904, Bloom's Day, named after Leopold Bloom, whose Odyssey this day allows his wife to sin, but also incidentally, if not coincidentally, the day James first walked out with Nora Barnacle, future mother of Joyce's children, the couple's material creations. That production, too, just as with the Purefoy's production, required a specific form, male and female, and a specific pressure, making love. But the production does not mirror the parents. It is a free and unique individual, analogous to each reader's Dorian. Stephen offers many candidates for what sin might evoke his remorse, whether envious of Buck's popularity, slothfully daydreaming through his school lessons, too proud to sing for money, gluttonously drunk by the time of Oxen of the Sun, lustfully prowling Nighttown, or wrathfully striking Bella's lamp. If we focus on his covetousness, as in his encounters with Haynes and Eglinton, seeking pieces of silver in return for his artwork, we can follow the Agenbite clues to a drunk mock Judas leading a dark satyr to our Agenbuyer healer and herd in episode 14. Recalling, as saith Augustine too, we are linked up with by a successive anastomosis of naval cords. Stephen here demonstrates his grasp of contingency. Just as the Bible traces our individual contingency back to the first parents, Stephen states the case in Oxen as he had in the library, that spiritual production, art, too, relies upon its parent contingently, umbilical to umbilical. However, in his destitute condition, he remains conflicted because he has yet to learn a lesson that the mature artist demonstrates by example. Profit is not necessarily compatible with art's purity. Joyce's example, illustrated by the parallelism between two characters' names, contrasts antitheses, art and life. With a little effort, Philip Beaufoy's production earned him some money and fleeting fame. With Herculean effort, Mina Purefoy pushed out another lump of love. These productions, spiritual and material, participate in a process closest to what Sir William Ross calls Aristotle's concept of theology. Actual things, particulars, can be evil or improper. On the other hand, universals and things yet to be actualized only participate in the first cause, that perfect motion inspired by Aristotle's prime mover that began the universe. As perfect, that motion continues forever, each change requiring its own author, resulting in its own entelechy. Readers witness the entelechy of Beaufoy's production, holding no more lasting value than yesterday's racing form. Beaufoy's pretty art serves its final purpose as Bloom's toilet paper. By contrast, the end and value of Mrs. Purefoy's production won't be written until Master Purefoy writes it. Considering Joyce mocks himself as Beaufoy's mirror image, it would seem the mature artist found this Bloomsday lesson particularly critical in his young avatar's quest to become artist. Whose mirror is better, pretty or pure? Hamlet's mirror isn't perfect, as Crane notes. Like Zola's, it might be faithful, but the mousetrap did not achieve the prince's desired results. Art does not work like a law of nature, and text cannot change. Freedom in artistic creation, analogous to free will of the creation, cannot be in the artifact. It exists only as the reader's grasp, which depends upon the effort or pressure invested. If Ulysses were a report, we could tally its columns. Were Ulysses a mystery novel, interpretation would lead to a culprit. Ulysses is neither report nor mystery novel. It cannot be solved. The solution is not in the text, because the text allows for many views purposefully, if for nothing else, to maintain the author's immortality. Those multiple views derive from the cracks Joyce placed as temptations. Temptation only works on the curious, and curiosity is never inspired by the certain. While he couldn't be certain all would, Joyce had faith some readers would have the will to ferret out his sense, but he also, godlike, gave the reader the freedom to determine that sense individually, uniquely. Joyce, who died of a perforated ulcer just shy of 59, lives, so far seemingly immortal, just as long as readers turn and keep returning to the work. That pressure makes every reader's Ulysses unique, and that form keeps James Joyce alive.